The savanna at dusk carries a silence that feels endless, broken only by the distant call of vultures circling above. In that silence, a desperate cry rose from the tall grass, sharp and haunting. A young hyena had become entangled in a twisted strand of barbed wire left behind on the edge of a forgotten ranch. Every struggle only made the wire bite deeper into its skin. Blood matted its spotted fur, and exhaustion clouded its amber eyes. Most would turn away. Most would say it was only a hyena, a scavenger, a beast unworthy of saving. But what happened next defied every expectation. Because the one who came to its rescue was the last person anyone would have imagined, and the moment they locked eyes, everything changed. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss any of our most powerful stories, stories that reveal the truth about resilience, courage, and unexpected bonds. This isn't just a story about survival. It's a story about compassion in the unlikeliest of places, and about how one small act can transform not just a life, but an entire way of seeing the world. What unfolded on that dusty plain will make you question everything you thought you knew about hyenas, about fear, and about the power of kindness. And it all started with the sound of wire tightening against flesh, and a stranger who decided to stop walking. The sun was sinking low, painting the savanna in streaks of orange and crimson, when David Marshall first heard the sound. At first, he thought it was the wind whistling through dry brush. But then it came again, a broken, guttural cry that didn't belong to the wind at all. It was the sound of something alive, something in pain. David wasn't supposed to be here. He was a 38-year-old veterinarian from Colorado who had taken a temporary position at a wildlife rehabilitation center in Kenya. His time there was nearly finished, and he had planned to spend this evening sketching the horizon, something he often did to ease his restless mind. Instead, his boots pressed deeper into the dry earth as he followed the sound that grew louder, more desperate. And then he saw it. A hyena, young but fully grown, was caught in a snarl of barbed wire left carelessly along the border of abandoned farmland. The wire, once meant to corral cattle, had rusted and fallen, becoming a deadly trap for anything unlucky enough to pass through. The animal's legs were twisted in the metal strands, the barbs slicing into its flesh every time it jerked in panic. Its sides heaved with labored breaths, and its eyes, those wide, golden eyes, met his with something that struck David hard. Fear, yes, but also a plea. For a long moment, David froze. Instinct told him this was dangerous. A wounded hyena could lash out, its jaws stronger than any dog he had ever treated back home. His training reminded him of the risks, the infections, the possibility of being attacked if he got too close. But then he saw the blood soaking the soil beneath its paw, the trembling body too weak to keep struggling, and something inside him silenced the warnings. He whispered, more to himself than to the animal, "I can't just leave you here." Step by step, he approached. The hyena growled low, baring its teeth, but the sound lacked the conviction of an animal that truly wanted to fight. It was tired. It was hurting. David crouched a few feet away, his hands open, showing he carried nothing but calm. "Easy, it's okay," he said softly, as though his voice could bridge the gap between fear and trust. He studied the wire. The barbs had dug deep, particularly around the front leg and hindquarters. Removing them would take time. He reached for the multi-tool in his belt, the same one he used daily at the sanctuary. As the blade glinted in the fading sunlight, the hyena's gaze followed it, its breathing quickening. David paused. He realized how absurd it was, explaining himself to a wild animal, but he did it anyway. "I'm here to help. Just stay with me." The first cut was the hardest. The wire snapped, recoiling with a sharp twang, and the hyena flinched violently. David's heart raced, but he didn't pull back. Sweat rolled down his neck as he worked methodically, cutting one strand after another, each motion deliberate and steady. The animal's growls grew weaker, replaced by shallow pants. It no longer thrashed. It just watched him, those amber eyes burning with a mixture of pain and reluctant trust. For a moment, David imagined what it must feel like, to be trapped, to not understand why, and to see only one figure standing between life and death. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. His hands were scratched, his arms ached, and the scent of blood filled the air. Still he pressed on. Finally, with one last snip, the final loop of wire fell away. The hyena didn't bolt. It didn't attack. Instead, it lay there, chest heaving, as though trying to decide whether this human had been real or some hallucination born from suffering. David backed away slowly, giving it space. "You're free now," he whispered. "Go." But the hyena didn't move. Its gaze followed him, unblinking, as though tethered to him by something stronger than the wire had ever been. That was when David noticed the deeper cuts, the wounds that wouldn't heal on their own. Infection was a certainty if left untreated. He knew if he walked away now, this rescue would mean nothing. He stood torn, the vast plains stretching around him, the sky bruising into night. Taking the hyena back to the sanctuary meant putting himself at risk, not just from the animal itself but from the scrutiny of those who already mistrusted his compassion for predators. Many locals saw hyenas as pests, creatures unworthy of care. He had heard them mutter about his soft heart, his foolishness in wasting resources on scavengers. But looking at the animal before him, trembling and broken yet still alive, he knew he couldn't abandon it. David whispered again, more firmly this time. "I'll get you through this. I promise." He moved carefully, pulling the blanket from his pack. He had brought it to sit on while sketching, but now it had a greater purpose. Step by step, he approached. The hyena didn't fight when he draped it across its back. It only groaned softly, eyes closing for the first time since he'd arrived. With effort, David lifted the weakened animal into the back of his truck. The metal bed clanged under the weight, startling them both, but the hyena didn't resist. It simply curled its body, trembling as though surrendering to the unknown. David climbed into the driver's seat, hands trembling as he started the engine. Dust rose behind the wheels as he turned toward the sanctuary. The night pressed in around them, heavy and full of unseen eyes. And as the headlights carved a path through the dark, David glanced into the rearview mirror, catching the faint glimmer of golden eyes watching him. Neither of them knew it yet, but that night marked the beginning of something far greater than a rescue. It was the start of a bond that would defy fear, prejudice, and even the wild itself. And just as the sanctuary's lights flickered in the distance, David realized the hardest part hadn't even begun. The gates of the sanctuary creaked open as David drove in, headlights slicing through the night air. He pulled up to the quarantine shed, a low structure built for injured animals that needed monitoring before they could join the others in open enclosures. His heart pounded with a mix of urgency and doubt. What if the hyena didn't survive the night? What if his colleagues saw this as a reckless waste of effort? He stepped out of the truck and approached the bed where the hyena lay curled, its breaths shallow, its body trembling with fatigue. The animal didn't move as he opened the back and slid the blanket toward the ground. Slowly, carefully, David lifted the creature again, bracing under its weight, surprised by how heavy it felt for something so thin and wounded. He whispered as he carried it inside. "Almost there, buddy. Just hang on." Inside the shed, the air smelled of disinfectant and hay. He laid the hyena onto a bed of straw, his hands working quickly to check the wounds. The wire had left deep grooves in its legs and torso, angry and swollen. Infection was already setting in. He washed the gashes with antiseptic, his fingers steady despite the growls that rose from the animal's throat. But the growls weren't violent. They were more like a reminder that it was still alive, still fighting. David paused once, meeting those golden eyes again. "You're tougher than anyone gives you credit for," he said softly. "Let's prove them wrong." Hours passed. He cleaned, stitched, and bandaged. When he was done, he stepped back, sweat soaking his shirt. The hyena was resting now, its breathing more even, the tension in its muscles fading slightly. For the first time that night, David let himself sit, exhaustion pulling at his shoulders. He could still hear the faint cries of other animals outside, but here in the shed it was quiet, just him and the wounded scavenger that so many would have left to die. The next morning, his decision met resistance. "You brought a hyena?" Elena, one of the senior caretakers, stared at him with disbelief as she stepped into the shed. Her dark hair was tied back tightly, her eyes sharp with disapproval. Do you realize what you've done? These animals aren't like lions or elephants. People hate them. They're thieves, nuisances, dangerous to livestock. The board won't approve resources for this. David didn't flinch. He had expected this. It was dying. I couldn't leave it there. Elena folded her arms. And when it tears through the fencing or attacks the others? What then? You'll be responsible for that too. He looked back at the hyena, which lifted its head weakly, as though it knew it was the center of debate. Give it a chance, David said firmly. If it doesn't recover, I'll take full responsibility. But if it does, maybe it'll show us something we've all overlooked. Elena sighed, shaking her head. You always see too much in them. Don't forget, compassion is expensive here. She left, her words lingering like smoke. The days that followed tested every ounce of David's resolve. The hyena, whom he had begun calling kovu, meaning scar, in Swahili, refused to eat at first. It snarled at the bowls of meat and water placed in front of it, turning its head away as if rejecting help entirely. Each night, David stayed late, sitting near the straw bed, speaking in low tones. He told the animal about Colorado winters, about the mountains he grew up climbing, about the reason he had chosen this life, to give creatures considered worthless a second chance. The first sign of progress came quietly. One evening, as David sketched the outline of a tree against the shed wall, he noticed movement from the corner of his eye. Kovu's head was lowered, teeth carefully pulling at the meat left in the bowl. The sound of chewing filled the silence, and David smiled for the first time in days. That's it, he whispered. You're still fighting. But not everyone shared his joy. Rumors spread quickly through the staff about the crazy American wasting medical supplies on a scavenger. One worker suggested that if Kovu survived, he would only cause trouble, sneaking into villages to terrorize livestock. Another whispered that David was endangering the sanctuary's reputation. The tension grew heavier when, one morning, they discovered the gate to the quarantine shed ajar. Inside, Kovu was pacing weakly, as though testing his strength. Someone had deliberately left it open, hoping the animal would escape, or die trying. David's stomach dropped as he resecured the lock, realizing this wasn't just about saving one hyena. This had become a battle against the prejudice rooted deep in human hearts. That night, David stayed later than usual, sitting on the ground just outside the bars. Kovu came closer than ever before, its nose almost brushing the gap between them. The animal's breath was hot and heavy, its eyes fixed on him with a look he couldn't describe, part suspicion, part curiosity, and something else. For a fleeting second, David felt that Kovu understood his struggle too, that they were both fighting to be seen for what they truly were. I won't let them get rid of you, he promised. His voice cracked, the weight of his vow pressing down on him. Not while I still have a choice. The hyena huffed softly, lowering itself onto the straw. It was the first time David had seen it rest without flinching at every sound. Something had shifted between them, fragile but undeniable. And yet, as he closed the shed for the night, David couldn't shake the fear that others might try again. The sanctuary wasn't safe, not for Kovu, not for the bond they were building. By the time the moon climbed high above the savannah, David understood one thing. Saving this hyena was no longer just about healing wounds. It was about proving to the world, and maybe even to himself, that compassion wasn't weakness. It was strength. And as the wind carried distant howls from the wild, David realized their fight had only just begun. The days stretched into weeks, and the rhythm of the sanctuary carried on. The calls of rescued birds at dawn, the deep roars of lions at dusk, and the constant hum of life that thrived just beyond the fences. Yet for David, all of it blurred into the singular focus of one patient, Kovu. Every morning he arrived at the quarantine shed with food, water, and the same quiet determination. Kovu had begun eating more consistently now, though only when David was nearby. At first, it seemed coincidence. But the pattern held. When other caretakers left food, the hyena ignored it. When David appeared, sketchbook tucked under his arm, Kovu would drag the bowl closer with his teeth and begin to eat. It's like he's waiting for you, murmured a young volunteer one afternoon, watching from a distance. David smiled faintly but didn't answer. Inside though, the thought warmed him. Trust was forming, not quickly, not easily, but unmistakably. The wounds were healing too. Each time David changed the bandages, he noticed the swelling subsiding, the angry red gashes closing into scars. The hyena no longer growled when he touched its legs, only tensed briefly, then relaxed. For David, every small step forward felt monumental, proof that his decision to bring Kovu here hadn't been in vain. But outside the shed, the tension was building. Sanctuary staff continued whispering that the hyena was a waste of resources. Villagers visiting with injured livestock muttered about the foreigner who saves thieves. Even Elena, though she had stopped openly criticizing, never missed a chance to remind David of the risks. One evening, after finishing a long shift with the elephants, she found him still at Kovu's side. "You know," she said, arms crossed, "some bonds can't be forced. Sometimes the best mercy is letting go." David didn't look up. He was cleaning Kovu's paw, his touch careful, precise. "And sometimes," he replied softly, "the best mercy is giving them a chance no one else will." Elena shook her head but didn't argue further. Still, her words lingered, heavy in the air. Progress continued, fragile but steady. One afternoon, David left the shed door slightly open, sitting just outside with his sketchbook. To his amazement, Kovu stepped out on his own, limping, cautious, but unafraid. The hyena sniffed the ground, the air, even moved close enough that its shoulder brushed David's arm. David didn't move, afraid to break the moment. When Kovu finally returned inside, David exhaled a laugh, almost disbelieving. It was a breakthrough, proof that trust could grow where no one thought it possible. But the savannah has a way of testing even the strongest bonds. The setback came 3 nights later. A storm rolled across the plains, lightning ripping through the dark sky, rain drumming the tin roof of the sanctuary. David had stayed late again, ensuring the animals were secure, when a commotion erupted near the quarantine sheds. He sprinted toward the noise, heart pounding, flashlight beams slicing the rain. The sight stopped him cold. The shed door was wide open, swaying in the storm winds. Inside, straw was scattered, overturned bowls glistened with rainwater, and Kovu was gone. For a moment, panic flooded him. He rushed inside, scanning the ground. Tracks, paw prints pressed into the wet soil, led toward the outer fence. His flashlight followed them until they disappeared into the tall grass beyond. David's stomach churned. If Kovu wandered into the wild in his still weakened state, he wouldn't last. Worse, if villagers spotted him near their herds, they might not hesitate to kill him. "Who opened this?" David shouted into the storm, but no one answered. He already knew. Someone had left the gate unlatched again. Without hesitation, he grabbed his raincoat and followed the tracks into the night. Thunder cracked overhead, lightning illuminating the plains in jagged flashes. He called out, not loudly but enough. "Kovu, where are you?" Somewhere in the darkness, a low cry answered, sharp and pained. David ran, slipping in the mud, his clothes soaked, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly. He found Kovu tangled once more, but not in wire this time. The hyena had stumbled into a fallen branch, its weakened body too fragile to push free. It yelped as David approached, snapping its jaws in fear. David dropped to his knees, ignoring the mud soaking into his pants. "It's me," he said, voice steady despite his racing heart. "I've got you." This time, the hyena didn't resist. Maybe it recognized him in the stormlight, maybe it was simply too exhausted to fight, but it stilled, allowing David to lift the branch and free its body. He ran his hands along its flank, feeling the tremors of exhaustion coursing through it. "You can't do this alone," David whispered, pulling the animal close for the first time. The rain plastered its fur to his chest, the wild scent of blood and earth filling his lungs. For one fragile moment, man and hyena leaned into each other, both trembling, both alive. With great effort, David guided Kovu back toward the sanctuary, one arm steadying the animal as they trudged through the mud together. Every step felt like a battle against the storm, but they pressed on, side by side. By the time they returned, the rain had slowed. David secured the shed door himself, double-checking every latch. He laid fresh straw, dried Kovu's soaked fur with towels, and sat until dawn, watching over him as he slept. When the first light of morning spilled into the shed, David realized something had shifted again, something deeper than before. Kovu had not just been rescued. He had chosen, in his own way, to stay near David, to trust him enough not to vanish into the night. But David also knew this wasn't the end of their trials. Someone inside the sanctuary wanted Kovu gone, and the wild beyond the fences held dangers far greater than rainstorms. The bond between man and hyena was growing stronger, but so were the forces determined to tear it apart. And as David leaned back against the wall, exhaustion finally pulling at his eyes, one question haunted him. How far would he be willing to go to protect an animal the rest of the world saw as worthless? The storm had passed, leaving the savannah heavy with the smell of wet earth and the low hum of insects waking to the light. Foremost at the sanctuary, it was just another morning after a restless night. But for David, it was the start of a battle he knew he could no longer ignore. Word of Kovu's escape and David's desperate pursuit into the storm spread quickly. By mid-morning, whispers had turned into pointed questions, and questions hardened into confrontation. "You risked your life for that thing?" one worker muttered as David walked past, his boots still caked with dried mud. "That thing has a name," David snapped, but his voice carried more weariness than anger. He had spent the night in the shed, ensuring Kovu stayed calm, and exhaustion showed in the slump of his shoulders. At the staff meeting later that day, the air felt heavier than the storm clouds that had loomed the night before. Elena stood at the head of the room, her tone measured but her words sharp. This sanctuary was built to protect species that matter: elephants, lions, rhinos. Animals that bring donors, attention, and real conservation value. Hyenas don't fit that category. David clenched his jaw. So we only protect what's popular? What looks good on a brochure? Since when is compassion selective? A murmur spread across the table. Some avoided his gaze, unwilling to step into the fight. Others nodded subtly, agreeing with Elena's logic. Elena pressed on. Resources are limited. Every vial of medicine you use on that scavenger could be saving something worth saving. David's fists tightened on the table. He wanted to shout, to tell them how Kovu's golden eyes had locked onto his in the rain, how trust had blossomed in moments when all hope seemed lost. But he knew words alone might not sway hearts hardened by practicality. Still, he refused to yield. He's alive because of this sanctuary. Because of us. That means we're responsible. Whether you like it or not, Kovu deserves a chance. The room fell silent, heavy with unspoken judgment. Elena finally sighed, shaking her head. Fine. But the board will hear about this. And when they decide he's a liability, don't say you weren't warned. The meeting ended, but the unease lingered. David stepped outside, the sun beating down on his skin, sweat mingling with frustration. He knew Elena was right about one thing. The board could end this with a single decision. Kovu's future was hanging by a thread, and so was David standing here. That evening, as he checked on Kovu, he noticed something new. The hyena limped toward him with surprising strength, no longer dragging its leg but testing it, step by cautious step. It stopped just short of David, lowering its head. Slowly, carefully, David extended his hand. For the first time, Kovu pressed its nose against his palm, the gesture so small and yet so monumental that David's throat tightened. "You're proving them wrong," he whispered, his voice breaking with quiet pride. "Don't stop now." But outside the shed, the world wasn't softening. 2 days later, David visited the nearest village to pick up supplies. He carried bandages, disinfectants, and fresh meat packed in coolers. As he loaded his truck, a group of villagers approached. Their expressions carried no warmth, only suspicion. "You're the man with the hyena," one of them said, his voice clipped. David paused. "I'm the man who rescued a wounded animal, yes." The villager spat on the ground. "Hyenas kill our goats, steal from our families. You should have let it die." Others joined in, their words sharp and bitter. "Cursed animals. They bring bad luck. When it escapes, it will kill our children." David raised his hands in defense, though his heart was hammering. It's not like that. He's injured, recovering. He's no threat to you. But reason didn't ease their anger. The crowd grew louder, circling him with accusations that stung worse than any storm. Finally, an elder stepped forward, his face carved with years of hardship. You protect a thief while our people starve. Remember this, if that hyena comes near our land, we won't wait for your permission. We'll kill it. David loaded the last box into his truck, his jaw set, and drove back in silence. Their words echoed in his head with every mile. The world outside these fences would never forgive Kovu for what he was. Back at the sanctuary, David leaned against the shed door, watching Kovu chew on the meat he'd brought. The animal's body was still marked by scars, but its spirit seemed brighter. It lifted its head and studied David with that unblinking gaze, and for a fleeting moment, David imagined the hyena understood the threats that surrounded them both. We're running out of time, David said softly. If we're going to prove them wrong, we'll need more than survival. We'll need to show them something they can't ignore. The bond between them was undeniable now, but it was also fragile. Too fragile to withstand the weight of suspicion, prejudice, and fear. And yet, as the night deepened and the hyena settled against the straw, David felt a stubborn resolve harden in his chest. If the world saw Kovu as worthless, then he would dedicate himself to proving otherwise. Even if it meant standing alone. But David didn't yet realize that proving Kovu's worth would come at a cost neither of them were prepared for. Because just beyond the fences, danger was stirring again. Danger that would not wait for board meetings or village arguments. And when it came, it would force man and hyena to decide how much they were truly willing to sacrifice for each other. The sanctuary's silence that evening felt deceptive, like a curtain drawn over a stage where something dangerous waited in the shadows. David had spent the day monitoring the larger enclosures, but his mind never strayed far from the quarantine shed. Kovu was stronger now, strong enough to pace circles around the straw, his gait still uneven but filled with restless energy. David leaned against the gate, watching him. You're getting too big for this place, he murmured. Soon, we'll have to think about what's next. The thought weighed heavily. Releasing Kovu into the wild seemed impossible. The villagers had made their intentions clear. But keeping him here, in confinement, was just as cruel. David hoped the board might eventually reconsider, that Kovu could be transferred into one of the larger predator enclosures, perhaps even integrated with others. It was a fragile hope, and one he didn't dare voice. That night, however, the fragile balance shattered. A shout rang out across the sanctuary, followed by the frantic barking of dogs. David bolted upright, heart pounding, and sprinted toward the noise. His flashlight beam cut through the dark until it landed on two figures near the quarantine shed. Villagers. They had slipped past the outer fence, carrying crude spears and ropes. Stop! David's voice cracked the night air as he charged forward. The men froze, startled by his sudden appearance, but only for a moment. One pointed at the shed. That beast doesn't belong here. We end it tonight before it comes for our herds. David's pulse roared in his ears. He positioned himself between them and the gate. You'll have to go through me first. They hesitated, the stormlight of their anger colliding with the steel of David's resolve. The dogs barked louder, and soon other staff came rushing from the main buildings. Elena arrived breathless, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. Enough, she shouted, stepping between David and the villagers. You don't belong inside these fences. The intruders spat insults, but under the pressure of numbers, they retreated, disappearing into the dark. Their threat, however, lingered in the humid night air. When silence returned, Elena turned to David, her expression unreadable. Do you see now? This isn't just about you and that hyena. The villagers won't stop. And the board will never approve risking the sanctuary's reputation over this. David swallowed, the weight of her words heavy. But then he looked at Kovu, who had pressed his scarred face against the bars, watching everything with golden eyes that seemed to burn with a desperate understanding. In that gaze, David found his answer. No, he said firmly. I'm not giving up on him. The following days brought an uneasy calm. Security was tightened around the sanctuary, but whispers persisted. Some staff wondered aloud if David's stubbornness would cost them donors. Others avoided the shed entirely, as though Kovu were cursed. Then came the revelation that changed everything. One morning, while cleaning the wounds on Kovu's leg, David noticed something unusual. The hyena flinched when he touched near the hip, not with pain but with a strange stiffness. Concerned, he ran his hands along the bone and felt a ridge, unnatural, sharp beneath the skin. His heart sank. He ran tests in the small lab, X-rays borrowed from the veterinary wing. The results confirmed his fear. A fragment of barbed wire had remained embedded deep within Kovu's flesh, invisible until now. Left untreated, it would lead to infection and eventual death. David stared at the images, his chest tightening. "I thought I freed you completely," he whispered. The operation needed to happen soon, but it would be risky. The sanctuary wasn't equipped for complex surgery on predators, and anesthesia posed its own dangers. Worse, Elena would never approve. To her, the hyena wasn't worth the resources. He considered his options late into the night. Every path seemed impossible. If he went to the board, they would deny the request. If he told Elena, she would use the revelation as an excuse to end Kovu's life. And if he did nothing, Kovu would die slowly, painfully, his trust betrayed. Sitting in the dim light of the shed, David pressed his forehead against the bars. "What do I do, Kovu? How do I save you when no one else wants to try?" The hyena, resting in the straw, lifted his head. Their eyes met once more, that same silent exchange that had defined their bond since the first night in the rain. And for David, the answer became clear: he would have to operate himself. The decision terrified him. He wasn't a surgeon, at least not for procedures this invasive. But he had training, steady hands, and above all, resolve. He couldn't let Kovu slip away. Gathering supplies in secret, he prepared anesthetic doses, sterilized tools, bandages. He knew if anyone discovered his plan, it would mean the end of his position here, maybe even charges of negligence. But the thought of losing Kovu was worse. The night before the surgery, he sat in the shed, sketchbook open but forgotten. Kovu lay closer than ever, his breathing calm, scars glistening faintly in the lantern light. David reached through the bars, resting his hand against the animal's fur. To his surprise, Kovu didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into the touch, the weight of his head pressing softly against David's palm. In that moment, David realized this wasn't just about saving a hyena. It was about defying everything the world believed about them, about proving that even the most misunderstood creature deserved a chance at life. He closed his eyes, whispering into the quiet, "Tomorrow we fight for real." What neither man nor hyena knew was that tomorrow would test their bond in ways neither had imagined, and the outcome would decide both their futures. The night was unusually still, as if the savanna itself was holding its breath. The stars above glimmered cold and distant, offering no guidance for what David was about to attempt. Inside the quarantine shed, lantern light flickered across steel instruments laid out neatly on a table. Scalpels, clamps, antiseptic bottles, syringes of anesthetic. His hands trembled as he checked them for the 10th time. This wasn't how things were supposed to be done. He knew that. Surgeries of this scale required sterile rooms, advanced equipment, a team of trained professionals. But Kovu didn't have that luxury, and time was running out. The shard of barbed wire buried deep in his hip was a silent killer. David couldn't wait for permission that would never come. Kovu lay in the straw, head lifted, eyes glowing faintly in the lantern's dim glow. He seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, his body unusually calm, as though he understood that tonight would decide his fate. David crouched beside him, speaking softly. "I need you to trust me one more time. This is going to hurt. But if we get through it, you'll finally be free." He prepared the syringe, drawing in the precise dose of anesthetic. Administering it to a predator was always dangerous. Too little and the animal would wake mid-procedure, too much and the heart could stop. He steadied his hands, slid the needle into Kovu's flank, and whispered encouragement as the animal's breathing slowed into a heavy rhythm. When the hyena finally drifted into unconsciousness, David exhaled a shaky breath. "All right, let's do this." The first incision sliced through fur and scar tissue, and blood welled instantly. David dabbed it away, his movements quick but controlled. He located the ridge of metal just beneath the muscle, jagged and cruel. His heart pounded as he worked, the air thick with tension. Minutes dragged into eternity. Every motion of the scalpel felt like walking a tightrope above disaster. Sweat streamed down his face, blurring his vision, but he didn't dare pause. Finally, the tip of the wire gleamed under the light, slick with blood. Carefully, he maneuvered the clamp, gripping the shard and pulling. Kovu twitched violently, a low groan escaping his throat even under sedation. David froze, heart hammering. "Stay with me," he whispered, tightening his grip. With one final tug, the shard slid free, glistening in the lantern glow. He held it aloft for a second, astonished by how something so small had caused so much suffering. But the battle wasn't over. Blood gushed from the wound, threatening to undo everything. David pressed gauze hard against it, hands working furiously to stitch the muscle back together. His fingers cramped, his vision swam, but he didn't stop. The thought of losing Kovu now was unbearable. When the last stitch was tied and the wound bandaged, David slumped back against the wall, chest heaving. His shirt was soaked, his hands trembling, but the shard of barbed wire lay on the table, a victory pulled from the jaws of failure. Hours passed in silence. David sat vigil beside Kovu, refusing to leave, his mind replaying every moment of the surgery. Doubt gnawed at him. Had he done enough? Would the animal survive the night? As dawn crept through the cracks in the shed, Kovu stirred. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then locking onto David. For a long, suspended moment, neither moved. Then Kovu shifted slightly, releasing a low, rasping breath, not a growl, but something closer to relief. David's throat tightened. He reached through the bars, his hand hovering just inches from the animal's fur. "You made it," he whispered, his voice breaking. "We did it." Kovu lowered his head onto the straw, too weak to move further, but his eyes never left David's. And in that gaze, David saw not just survival but trust forged in fire, an unspoken acknowledgement that they had crossed an impossible threshold together. But triumph was short-lived. Later that morning, Elena stormed into the shed, her face pale with fury. "What have you done?" she demanded, eyes flicking to the instruments still stained with blood, the exhausted hyena, the bandages fresh and unmistakable. David rose slowly, his exhaustion giving way to steel. "I saved his life." "You risked everything," Elena shot back. "If he died under your hands, the board would shut us down. Do you realize the scandal this could cause?" "I didn't have a choice," David said firmly. "If I'd waited, he'd be dead already." Elena's glare wavered, just for a moment, as her gaze fell on Kovu. The hyena's sides rose and fell with slow, steady breaths, a living testament to David's defiance. "You think this proves your point?" she asked coldly. "It proves nothing but your recklessness." David stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "It proves that he matters. That his life is worth saving, no matter what anyone says." For a long, tense moment, they stared at each other. Then Elena turned sharply and left, slamming the door behind her. David sank back onto the straw, exhaustion finally pulling him under. As he drifted into uneasy sleep, he knew Elena would go to the board. His future here was more uncertain than ever. But when he woke hours later and saw Kovu lifting his head, eyes alert, he knew one thing with absolute clarity: the fight was worth it. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, David sat sketching by the shed. Kovu shuffled closer, resting against the bars, the faint weight of his presence grounding David in a way nothing else could. For the first time since arriving in Kenya, David felt not like a visitor, but like someone exactly where he was meant to be. Yet even as hope blossomed, shadows lengthened. The villagers hadn't forgotten their threats. The board wouldn't stay silent forever. And Elena's anger was a storm yet to come. David closed his sketchbook, his gaze meeting Kovu's once again. "We're not done," he said softly. "The hardest part is still ahead." And somewhere in the distance, carried on the wind, the howl of wild hyenas echoed through the night. an omen of battles yet to come. The weeks that followed the surgery were marked by quiet determination and an unspoken urgency. Kovu grew stronger each day, his limp fading until only a faint stiffness remained. The once wounded scavenger now moved with cautious confidence, pacing the shed, his golden eyes sharp and alive. David had kept his secret as long as possible, but whispers spread quickly in a place where everyone watched everyone else. It was only a matter of time before the board arrived. They came on a scorching afternoon, a trio of men in pressed shirts and polished shoes, their briefcases out of place against the dusty savanna backdrop. Elena greeted them with practiced efficiency, leading them straight to the quarantine shed. David followed in silence, his chest tight with dread. "This," Elena announced, gesturing toward the enclosure, "is the hyena that has caused so much debate." Kovu lifted his head, scars glistening in the harsh light, his gaze wary but steady. One of the board members scoffed. "A hyena? This is what we've wasted funds on." David stepped forward, his voice firm though his hands trembled at his sides. "Not wasted, invested. Look at him. He was left to die in barbed wire, infected, broken. Now he's alive because we chose compassion over convenience." The men exchanged skeptical glances. Another shook his head. "Donors don't fund scavengers. They fund elephants, rhinos, species people admire." David's voice sharpened. "Then maybe donors need to understand that every life matters. That resilience and courage don't come only from creatures we find beautiful. This hyena survived pain that would have killed most animals. He trusted me when no one else believed he could. Isn't that worth something?" The shed fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Elena shifted uncomfortably, her gaze flicking between David and the board. One of the men sighed. "We'll deliberate. But understand this, Dr. Marshall, if this hyena ever endangers the sanctuary's reputation, the decision will be final." They left, their polished shoes carrying the judgment that could undo everything. David leaned against the bars, his breath shaky. Kovu pressed closer, resting his scarred flank against the steel, as though grounding him. "We're not finished," David whispered. "Not yet." That night, danger returned, this time not from the board, but from the villagers. Shadows moved beyond the fences, torches flickering against the darkness. Shouts echoed in the distance, carried on the wind. David's heart seized as he realized what was happening. The villagers had come back, stronger in number, determined to end what they saw as a curse. He rushed to the shed, grabbing tools and shouting for the guards. But the sanctuary's security was thin, and the villagers pushed closer, their anger louder than reason. "Give us the beast," they cried. "We won't let it steal from us again." Kovu growled low, his body tense, eyes locked on the chaos beyond the bars. David stood in front of the shed, his chest heaving. "You'll have to go through me," he shouted, his voice breaking against the night. For a terrifying moment he thought they might. The torches flared, the crowd surged. But then something happened, something no one expected. Kovu let out a long, piercing call, the kind hyenas use to rally their clans. The sound rolled over the sanctuary, eerie and commanding, vibrating deep into the night. And from beyond the hills, answers came. The wild hyenas responded, their chorus rising in the dark. The villagers froze. Fear flickered across their faces as the savanna filled with the cries of unseen creatures. To them, it wasn't just one hyena anymore. It was a pack, a force of nature, a reminder that this land was not theirs alone. Slowly, step by step, they retreated, their torches dimming until the night swallowed them whole. David collapsed against the fence, trembling. Inside the shed, Kovu stood tall, his chest rising and falling with pride. For the first time, David didn't see a wounded animal. He saw a survivor, a leader, a creature that had reminded the world he was never truly alone. The board's decision came the next morning. Perhaps it was fear of the villagers, perhaps the growing tension, but they declared Kovu must be removed. "He is not safe here," they ruled. "Find another solution." David felt the weight of defeat crush him. But as he looked at Kovu, calm and watchful, he knew surrender wasn't an option. If the sanctuary rejected him, then David would find another way. With Elena's reluctant help, he arranged for a small, private reserve on the sanctuary's outskirts, an unfenced stretch of land where Kovu could roam under David's watch. It wasn't freedom, not entirely, but it was a chance at life. The day they moved him, Kovu walked beside David without a leash, no ropes or chains. Just trust. They reached the open plain, golden grass swaying under the wind, and Kovu stopped, lifting his head to the sky. For a moment, he looked back at David, their eyes locking in one final silent promise. Then he trotted forward into the wild light, scars gleaming, alive. David stood watching, his heart heavy but full. He knew their paths would cross again, perhaps not in enclosures or sheds, but under the vast sky, where survival was the only law. As the sun dipped low, painting the savannah in fire and shadow, David whispered, "You're free now. But you'll always be mine." And with that, he turned toward the future, carrying with him the lesson Kovu had carved into his soul, that compassion is not weakness, that trust is not foolishness, and that even the most misunderstood creature can teach us the true meaning of resilience. If this story touched your heart, remember, courage can come from the most unlikely places and compassion can change the world. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that every life, no matter how overlooked, has value. Together, let's keep spreading stories of hope, resilience, and the bonds that can change everything.